Look, I'm a big believer in that employees have to feel good about coming to work every day. And I think with that, you get a couple of things. You get, I think, a better customer experience, because if they're feeling good coming in and feeling like they're valued, they're going to treat that customer, if they're a call center person, for example, on the phone, in a good way, in a different way, and really feel good about their job. I think the others, it measures leadership and how leadership is doing in terms of their behaviors and how they're treating their employees.
Hi, and welcome to BetterWorks People Fundamentals podcast. I'm Michelle Goldsberry, Senior Content Marketing Manager here at BetterWorks. BetterWorks' core belief in people fundamentals revolves around helping HR lead through constant change by focusing on core values like fairness, support, balance, and enabling growth opportunities for employees. These tenets empower everyone in the workforce to strive for excellence, to foster creativity, and to acknowledge each other's contributions. BetterWorks believes that strategic HR leaders can translate these principles into action, shaping their workforce for the better and helping drive meaningful business outcomes. And in this show, we're diving even deeper into these principles by listening to experts share how you can make them come alive at your organization. In this episode, I'm joined by Margaret Keane, former CEO of Synchrony and now CEO of Sisiv. Margaret is known for her people-first approach to leadership and for transforming Synchrony into one of the most admired workplaces in financial services. In our conversation, we explore what it really means to lead with both data and heart, from using employee sentiment to guide culture decisions to balancing quantitative insights with human intuition. We talk about how she's used employee surveys and open feedback to shape culture and build trust through times of uncertainty. Margaret also shares how her leadership has evolved through times of disruption, how she approached big decisions during uncertainty, and how she sees AI reshaping leadership and the future of work. If you've ever wondered about how to keep empathy and data in balance and how to build trust and transparency in a world driven by technology, this conversation will give you practical insight into what today's workforce really needs from its leaders. Margaret Keane, thank you so much for joining the People Fundamentals podcast, and welcome.
Thank you so much, Michelle. I'm happy to be here.
Great. Well, in this season's podcast, our theme is data-driven decision-making. So who better to talk to than a two-time CEO who's led one of the top consumer financial services companies? So let's jump right into it. But before we get into the, deep dive into data, in a previous conversation, we were talking about values, and your values are really connected to how you view and use data. So I'm wondering, what are your values as a leader that you believe have defined you throughout your career?
Well, I think for me, my values, probably the number one value is really respect people where they are and try to understand where they are. I think whether you're a CEO, you're leading a team, or you're an employee themselves, I think respect for each other is probably one of the most values, because in my opinion, we all come to work to do a great job, and making sure we respect people's views. And it doesn't mean we always have to agree with them, but also make sure you're listening is, I think, a really, really important value. So that's one that I hold very high. I think the other is just, in general, teamwork. And it really does take a village, as they say. So I think having the ability to really bring your team along as a leader, and then being part of a team and being a highly functioning team member, I think is extremely important.
Whether it was at Synchrony, which is formerly GE Capital Retail Finance, or now at Sisiv, how have you used data to guide workforce decisions?
I think data was a big part of how I ran Synchrony. I would tell you from multiple angles, whether it was, we were big believers in the Great Places to Work survey, as an example, which is a survey really based on trust. And it measures how employees feel about their leadership, meaning their immediate boss, as well as the organization overall, leaders leading the whole company. And I will tell you that we held close to that, and you're able to also integrate your values into the questions. So I think when I first kicked off the company as a new company, we spent a lot of time thinking about our values. And then it's great to have values, right? It's great to have them. It's great to show them. But if you're not living them as a company or as leaders, then it's kind of meaningless. So to me, we really dug deep on our values and really leveraged those values to drive the behavior inside the company, and using the Great Places to Work survey as a real barometer about how the employees were feeling about the company. And, there's the questions, which are, great questions, but I think the real fun is in the open answered kind of questions where they write in answers. And then you can really get a flavor for what's happening. And then from that, we actually had action plans around like, what are the top 3 things? And the other thing on the Great Places to Work survey, you could zero in on the most important questions. Like they'll tell you these 3 questions really measure how you're performing as a company from an employee perspective. And so you could really look at that by team leader, by location, by a different organizations within your company. And you could really see where you have gaps and then really drive some programs to really change the results. And, when we first started, I think we were number 75, I believe. It was either 77 or 75. And I think this year, Synchrony was number 2 in Great Places to Work. So clearly, the company over the years that we've done it, which is about 11 years, is a big, big movement.
Yeah. Why is employee sentiment data so valuable in your view? What is it telling you about how to improve the business or drive the business and the link to business outcomes?
Look, I'm a big believer in that employees have to feel good about coming to work every day. And I think with that, you get a couple of things. You get, I think, a better customer experience, because if they're feeling good coming in and feeling like they're valued, they're going to treat that customer, if they're a call center person, for example, on the phone, in a good way, in a different way, and really feel good about their job. I think the others, it measures leadership and how leadership is doing in terms of their behaviors and how they're treating their employees. And then all of that really, the real win is you get less turnover. So you have a highly engaged workforce who are delivering for your partners, which is most important, and less turnover, which saves you money. So I think to have a happy workforce is not an easy thing because there's so many things coming at people, but I think you can, but it requires work and focus.
And I would think too, beyond lower turnover, less churn, you also have higher productivity, right? Due to higher engagement, better customer service,
all those things,
perhaps better innovation.
All those things.
Right?
It pays off in the math. Yeah.
I'm curious if you think that CEOs, generally speaking, pay enough attention to those employee sentiment indicators.
Look, I think at some level, every CEO looks at this because, you really are leading an organization. It's not just, widgets. There's actual people at the end of the day. So I think most organizations pay attention to how their employees feeling. A lot of people participate, big companies participate in the Great Places to Work survey as an example, but there are other surveys as well. And I think most companies, especially if they're seeing high turnover and things like that, are going to dig a little deeper. I don't know if they were as systematic, or they are as systematic as Synchrony was, but certainly I think people do look at that.
Yeah. And at Cisiv, you're not using quarterly pulse surveys, is that right?
We're just starting now. We're starting to do quarterly pulse surveys. This is a new endeavor. We had a new HR leader join us in February. And, I think a couple of things since she came. We're working on our values. We're working on measurements. We're working on really understanding how the employee sentiment is inside the company. Obviously, a much different company. But look, I think it doesn't matter. We have a lot of people in Cisiv who are out there dealing with our clients. And we need them to feel like they're feeling valued inside the company.
Yeah. So are there particular signals that you're looking for to guide decisions about the workforce at Cisiv, or even to guide business decisions?
I don't think there's a specific signal. I think you get it through the surveys themselves on the questions that you put together. And then I think, again, I would say the more value is when you get write-in comments, because those comments tend to shed a little more light on what employees are feeling. But, we look at the basic things in terms of, are we treating people with respect? Are we paying people fairly? Do people feel like their leaders are doing their jobs? those are the kinds of things you want to look at to make sure that as an organization, you're highly functioning.
Yeah. So with regard to those open-ended questions that you've talked about, the comments, are there any stories that you have of comments that you've received in the past, either as a result of a Pulse survey or the Great Places to Work, where it really just kind of opened leadership's eyes and you said, we need to make a change based on these? And I'm just curious what that might have been.
I'm gonna use the pandemic as an example, because we were doing some surveys aside from the Great Places to Work survey during the pandemic. We were trying to get a handle on how our employees were feeling, and I think two things we learned in that surveying process. One was we needed to communicate even more. There was just such a high level of uncertainty and fear, I think, in the country, right? That the employees were looking for more engagement of the senior team. So we were holding fairly significant town halls on various topics. We ended up bringing in a medical officer who would actually come on and give employee updates. We even included people's families in those discussions, because remember, we were all at home. But people were looking for answers, and not many people had all the answers, but they were looking for information. So we kind of filled that void, and that came out of some of the surveying we were doing where people wanted more. The second thing, and this is an interesting thing that came out, we did get feedback from employees who were for the first time working at home, who had families, where the families were at home, meaning the kids weren't at school. And there was a real concern, like, how do I handle all this while I'm working and the kids are at home? We ended up creating, for the summer, we had different people in the company volunteer to do different things. We did some cooking classes, we did crafts, we did readings, where different age groups would participate in these camps online to really help the families who were at home and stuck at home with the kids have some opportunity to engage. One of the probably best things that came out of that is we did across the world, like we have employees in India, Philippines, the US. People got to meet families that they normally would have never have met through the online camp. So it created like a different energy where people might have known the person who was working at Synchrony, but never met their kids or vice versa. So that created like another really fun thing that came out of the pandemic, if you could call it fun, where people just got to engage very differently.
Yeah, community building. I love that story. I just love that story. I'm wondering what kind of feedback you got from employees after you enacted that kind of after school. That wasn't even after school.
Oh, they loved it. Like, I mean, we got great feedback. People loved it.
Yeah,
people just loved it.
Did it change? Did it change the whole vibe in the company as employees got to know other employees in other parts of the world whom they might not have otherwise interacted
definitely.
with?
I think I think it definitely changed the vibe. I think particularly just building bridges and getting people to know each other differently. I think we all knew each other inside the office. Remember back then, we were all experiencing this weird thing of working at home. So it was unsettling for everybody. And, I think when we look back, I think both personally, probably, we've all tightened up relationships during COVID, right? And I think it allowed us to do that at the workplace.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I do want to ask you, in terms of how you make decisions, how closely do you and have you worked with your CHRO, and how do you view the CHRO's role in using data to help drive business strategy?
I would say highly engaged with my CHRO, both at Synchrony and here at CISO. I think we're still at the early stages of getting all the data we need at CISO, so I wouldn't say we're there yet, but I think we know what we need to do, and we're trying to manage all the things we're trying to do and taking baby steps to get some, what I would call, fundamental things in place. I'd say at Synchrony, my CHRO and I were business partner. I view the CHRO as a business partner, not just the person who sits in a corner doing HR. And I think in the world we're heading into, where we're really going to be impacting the workforce in a much different way with AI, I would assume every CEO is working closely with their CHRO now to really make sure they're business partners to help them and help the organization transform as this big transformation happens, with the understanding we don't know it all, right? Some of it is clear and easy, but a lot of this is very complicated. So I think the CHRO is fundamentally a big part of your business process and needs to be highly engaged in how you're leading the company.
At BetterWorks, we see that employee experience and business outcomes are closely knit together. So I'm curious, in your view, what is the role and the value of performance management in driving the business outcomes that you're looking for?
Yeah, I came from a company, we'll call back a bit to GE, which was a highly performance-driven company. So I come with that bias, I will tell you. And at GE, it was really a combination of not only your what, but the how. So what were your results? How did you deliver those results? And then how did you do it? How did you do it from a leadership perspective or an employee perspective around, what I would call a set of values? So I fundamentally believe that's an important part of running a company. And I think it's, honestly, it's fair to the employees. I think employees need to have goals and objectives. They need to know what we're asking of them, and they need to be clear on them. And then you want to make sure you're measuring them against those goals and objectives. And, it really comes down to reward and recognition. For the people who are really hitting it out of the park, you want to make sure you're recognizing them. And the only way you can really do that is not just by a gut feeling, but by looking at the results. And we're working on really putting a little more meat around goals and objectives inside of Decisive as we head into 2026, because I do think that's an important element.
So how do you build an organizational culture where, leaders and employees can make fast, effective decisions in the absence of having complete data, or maybe when it's unclear or even contradictory?
Well, I think you have to have a culture where people know that it's okay to make a mistake. I do think, though, the one caveat I would give, you may not have the full data, but I think you have to have the rationale around what it is you're trying to do and make sure you have that buy-in before you just go off willy-nilly doing something. Because I think you do have to have a framework from which you're working from and get buy-in from whoever it is you need buy-in from to execute what you're trying to do. So I think it's important in any decision, any big decision, any, fundamental decisions inside the company where maybe not everything is clear, black and white, you do have to give your rationale. And I think this is where the culture becomes important, because I do think you want to create an environment where people can debate a little bit and say, is this the right thing? Should we go down this path? What do you think? And making sure people have voice in that, so that when you do go down that path, you kind of have buy-in.
How have you created that for the employees and managers how did you do that at Synchrony? Or how are you trying to do that at Decisive? Create that atmosphere where people feel that they can be honest in evaluating.
I think Synchrony was a little unique in that, we had all worked together. My leadership team and I, most of us had worked together for quite a while. We went through a very, what the right word is, bonding process when we did the IPO. I mean, going through an IPO is pretty brutal, actually. It's 7 days a week, 24/7, getting everything ready. You're together all the time, so you better like each other and all those kind of fun things. So I think we really were a gelled organization when we left GE. I think to drive that in the organization, though, is where you got to help your leadership understand, again, what the expectation is, and making sure you're giving them the authority to kind of move forward. I think one of the big changes we had to make at Synchrony was people taking swings at things, because we did come from a company that I would say was extraordinarily buttoned up. Like, everything was, presentation, get in front. You had to have, 3 years worth of revenue or whatever it was. We were coming out a little green and new. And we weren't going to have all that information all the time as we were kind of evaluating where we wanted to go. So I do think you got to get the organization open to taking a little risk and moving forward. But I do think, look, the more highly engaged your employees are in your business, it helps innovation, helps product, helps the customer. And you just want to try to create that open environment to really drive that forward.
Yeah. Going back to data specifically for a second, are there stories that you have or times you can remember when, relying too heavily on the data maybe constrained thinking and what you did to break away from that?
Well, I'll go back to Synchrony again. It's not so much the data, it's like what I would call the critical points. So, in Synchrony, really our biggest, I think, magic is credit, right? Meaning, when are we opening up credit lines? When are we closing credit lines? And how you manage through those cycles, I think, are really important. And having leadership around you that you trust, where, the risk team, the guys who are, looking at models, looking at data, looking at customer behavior, a lot of times when you're making those decisions, you're making them a little off cycle. So, your risk leader might come in, even though things are looking good, he might say, hey, here's what I'm seeing or what I'm thinking. There are 2 points here where I think we're heading into maybe a tougher economic environment with our consumers. We have to tighten up. And sometimes it doesn't appear that clearly. It's more the person's experience plus a little bit of data. And so when you're making a decision like that, that's pretty profound for the organization if you're tightening up. It's the same as when you're loosening up, meaning, okay, you're on the other side, you're through what you think is the worst. Maybe now's the time to open up a little more on credit. And how do you do that? And I would say that as much as you use all of this great information and data, the smarter the risk person is to catching that earlier and getting, in each case, getting it earlier when you're tightening up and getting it a little earlier when you're loosening up, it creates a bit of a competitive advantage. And I think that's the best example of where the data may not align correctly, but you have a team around you that you really trust and have expertise, and you lean on them for that kind of decision-making.
Right. Experience and intuition born of that expertise and experience. Yeah. So I do want to chat a little bit about AI as a workforce enabler, because I'd be remiss if we didn't spend any time talking about AI and its impacts on the workforce and business. So, we all know that it's fundamentally changing the roles of many office workers and will continue to do so. We're seeing a number of large layoffs at this point. So what values guide you as a leader when implementing technologies like AI that may disrupt jobs, they may end jobs? It's very uncertain for the workforce and the business.
I think a couple of things. One, I do think it's going to change jobs. There's no question. There will be jobs that will go away, but they're going to be new jobs. They're going to be hopefully better jobs. So what I like to think of is, take, a customer service call of some sort, right? Think about yourself today. Like, we call these black boxes right now where there really isn't a human at the other end. We're caught in that vicious circle of never getting an answer. That's going to change. Like, you're going to have a bot who's going to give you the answer at some point. And one, from a consumer perspective, that's going to be like so enlightening. And then what's going to be able to happen is, if you're really in need of a more sophisticated conversation, there's going to be people available who are highly trained to take care of that. So I think from a customer experience perspective, I think over the next 3 years, probably, we're going to see a real change, I think, in just customer care. Because right now, the way most companies try to run is like not have you talk to anybody, right? Talk to the bot that sends you in the circle, and then you just, hang up the phone and get, frustrated. I think the AI that's coming online is going to be able to answer all those simple questions a lot easier, a lot more effectively. And then when you do have a problem, you're going to be able to talk to a human. So I think jobs are going to shift. The easy things are going to go away. The more complex things, you're going to be able to leverage a human. And then that creates a better job experience for that person. Now the question, and I think where everyone's nervous right now, is how many people do we need to do all of that? So I do think there'll be less certain jobs, but I think there's going to be new jobs. So I think the battle's still happening and it's very early. So I do think you're seeing a lot of companies kind of tightening up and saying we're going to hold either on hiring or we're tightening up because we already seen some benefits from the AI. But I think that's going to shift and we'll see new jobs being created as a result of AI. I think as a leader, you need to be clear with your employees that change is going to happen. And you need to help them think through what it means for them. Because I think to just stick your head in the sand and say change isn't coming is foolish. And I think, we have to make sure we're helping employees through that transformation, whether it means we're going to have less employees, which could be an outcome in certain areas, but then creating new jobs in other areas. And how do we do that? And how do we put the right programs in place to really help our employees, get trained up in different areas?
Yeah, I'm wondering, since the employee experience is so critical in your view, what are the principles that you follow when you're trying to figure out how AI is actually going to impact the business and the employees? What are the principles that you try to follow or the values that you try to follow to maintain an employee experience in the midst of disruption?
I think it's a very simple one. I think you got to just keep being out there and communicate to employees what is happening, what's going to happen, when it's going to happen. You have to be transparent. I've learned this in my career. I think, first of all, people sitting in jobs today are sitting there questioning what's going to happen to my job. So for you not as a leader not to be talking about these types of things, I think is unfair to the employees. So I think you just need to be as transparent as you can. Look, I would tell you, I don't have all the answers on AI for Decisive. I do think AI can help us a lot in certain areas, but it's still new. I think the easy stuff, we'll figure out. I think one question I have on AI is how do we create more revenue from AI? So are there AI products we can develop that help employers do a better job at finding the right candidates and hiring them? So, I think there's upside for us as a company, and that would create new jobs for people. So, I think we got to keep an open mind to all of this, but I don't think we could, stick our head in the sand and say it's not going to happen. It's going to happen. And I think if you're leading a company right now, it's your responsibility to get on it and figure out how you're going to leverage this type of technology to make your company better. Because if you don't, you're going to be left behind.
So today's zeitgeist is that there's also a lot of hype around AI and what it can actually do. And there's a sense that it's really not driving business. Yeah.
Yeah. I think like every new technology, that comes out, there's always hype. But this one feels a little more real, that it is coming. And I think for me, the question is how fast does it all come? There's many podcasts out there, some saying, the humans are gone in 10 years, to others saying, no, that's not going to happen. So I think it'll be paced at probably slower than what everyone thinks.
What must it prove? What must AI prove to be valuable to you as a business leader?
I think a couple of things. One, I'd say, can it get cost out? 2, can it make our processes better and more efficient for our partners? And are we giving better answers to our partners and making their needs better met by what we're delivering for them? So I think that's really important. That's probably even more important than the cost out piece, because if we're delivering a better product, a better solution, a faster solution for our partners, it's a win for them, which means it's a win for us, in my opinion. And then I think the third is, how do we ensure and this is still an unknown for me, so I'm just going to say, I think we got to be careful that we don't lose the human element to partnering and engaging with our employees and our partners as we all go through this new technological advancement, right? Because at the end of the day, from a customer perspective, it is about partnerships and relationships. And I think you don't want to let the AI take over, if you know what I mean. I think that human element has got to be held high.
So looking across your career from GE to Synchrony to Decisive, what has changed most about how you've used data to lead, and what has stayed the same?
So I think what stayed the same is, and I had a similar conversation the other night with my former CHRO at Synchrony. I've always highly engaged with the workforce, always. I've always been there. I meet them where they're at. I've always done, roundtables. I've always dug deep on getting as close as I can to the employees who are working with the customers, no matter where they are. That has not changed. I think what has changed for me, and this is a big one, and I think this became more clear when I became a public CEO, which is, as a public CEO, you really have to make sure that you're focused on the right things. Like, you can't be involved in everything. It is really, really important as a CEO that you're focused on what's most important for the future of the company. And in many cases, that's strategy, it's talent, it's succession planning, it's things like that. And, working with the investor community on where the company is going. And so from that, what I think is really important is making sure you have the A team around you. So having an A team helping you succeed as a CEO is just crucial, because you can't be everywhere. And you have to really rely on the team around you to really deliver the day-to-day. So I think that's something that, I think I always did that, but I think I did that even more when I was the CEO of Synchrony. And I'm trying to carry some of that over here at Decisive, although a much smaller company.
Yeah. Well, that's fantastic. And I wish you much success at Decisive. And I want to thank you for your time. This has been a super insightful conversation, very enlightening and just enjoyable. So thank you so much for joining us here on the podcast.
Thank you so much, Michelle. I really appreciate the conversation. Have a great day.
As we wrap up today's conversation with Margaret, a few insights stand out about what it really means to lead with both data and humanity. First, data is only the beginning. Margaret reminded us that numbers can inform decisions, but they can't replace the judgment, empathy, and intuition that define great leadership. The best leaders understand how to read between the lines and listen to what the data can't say. Second, culture and trust are measurable advantages. Whether through employee sentiment, pulse surveys, or one-on-one conversations, consistently listening to people helps shape stronger, more resilient organizations. And finally, leaders set the tone for how technology serves employees. As AI becomes more embedded in our work, leaders have a responsibility to be transparent, help employees adapt, and ensure that technology creates new opportunities, not just efficiency. Margaret's journey is a great reminder that when people feel valued and heard, performance flows naturally. Be sure to stay tuned for our next episode of the People Fundamentals podcast. Subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or YouTube Music. And if you like what you hear, share us with your friends and colleagues. We'll see you again soon.